What is down, everybody? It is your main course, Little Pancake. Welcome back to another amazing, wonderful, awesome video. I hope you're ready for a banger today. We are still in New Zealand, the island of New Zealanders. And we'll be talking about a very interesting animal today, a bird of sorts. I know we talked about a bird last time. These back-to-back birds, but they're different, all right? A penguin is its own category of animal, right? Penguins and birds are different, but birds and penguins aren't. A penguin is a bird, but a bird isn't a penguin, kind of like a square and a rectangle, you know? But yeah, we're talking about another bird today. We're talking about the takahe. This is one of the longest script/fact sheets I've ever written, so bear with me here. This might be a long one. Get you a Dr. Pepper, get you a nice cozy blanket, and let's get started. So, the takahe, also known as the South Island takahe, and the scientific name Porphyrio hochsteteri. Endemic to New Zealand. The name takahe comes from the Maori word takahe, which means to stamp or trample. So, you might get trampled, seems like. But I'm sure that's fine. They are considered a tawanga by natives, which means treasure. So they're very treasured by the native indigenous people in New Zealand, and those same people work very closely with the Department of Conservation to help protect the species, which is a cool kind of full circle thing. So the takahe is the largest living member of the rail family, which these are rails. It's a type of bird, and they share the name takahe with the North Island takahe, which is now extinct. So that's why they just refer to it as the takahe, because it's the only one left. But specifically, we're talking about the South Island takahe. The takahe is considered a flightless swamp hen, so he can't fly. They were officially named and described by Europeans in 1847. Now, throughout the second half of the 20th century, the north and south species of takahe were kind of slowly moved into subspecies. They were kind of like, yeah, this is looking like these are kind of the same species, you know. And so they transitioned them into subspecies. And they were moved into a different genus, the genus of Porphyrio, which is the same as the Australasian swamp hen. And then later, through some morphological and genetic studies, they were like, we had it right the first time, and they changed it back to the North and South Island takahes being two separate species instead of subspecies. Which that's just a windy road of taxonomy. So the North Island species, like I said, is extinct, and kind of what differentiates them is that they were taller and more slender. That was the main difference. They were a little taller, a little less compact. What is predicted to be their common ancestor is actually still a species living today. It is the Pancake, which is this pretty cool looking bird. And this speciation from Pancake into takahe was estimated to have occurred around 4 to 1.5 million years ago. Wide range. That's the way it always is when you're talking about that big of a time period, but a long time ago, but not that long ago in an evolutionary standpoint. So, what's this bird look like? How big is it? What's it doing? What's the motion like on this bird? It's a big bird. It's a big bird. On average, it's about 25 inches long, 63 centimeters, and males weigh about 6 pounds, 2.7 kilograms, and females weigh about 5.1 pounds, 2.3 kilograms. Not huge. I mean, it's not genius. It's not genius. It's not... What? Their height is also about 20 inches. So, they're a bit bigger than a chicken, you know? So, yeah. That's its size. Their lifespan in the wild is about 18 years. In captivity, it's a little longer, but that's normal. The bird is described as a stocky and powerful bird. So it packs a punch is pretty much what people in the takahe community are saying is, watch out, brother. They have very short legs, but they're powerful, and then they have a very large bill. I mean, look at this bill, sheesh, and that bill can deliver quite the bite. As aforementioned, the takahe is a flightless bird, but it does use its stubby little wings to help it climb steep slopes. So it'll kind of, while clawing, to get up a hill. As for its appearance, adult takahe's plumage, which is feathers, is typically a silky kind of appearance with a dark navy blue on the head, neck, and underside areas. So pretty much the whole chest, stomach area. The top sides of their wings are more of a peacock blue color, so a brighter blue. And then their backs and their inner parts of their wings are a much more greenish teal type of color, which then kind of transitions into an olive green type tail. And then the tail has a white underside. I mean, truly a beautiful bird. On addition to all those colors, they have some bright scarlet, deep red on the front sides of their heads, kind of like their foreheads a little bit. And then their legs also share this type of color. Color explosion on this bird. It's absolutely beautiful animal. As for chicks, they are typically a darker color, a black to a dark brown, with very fluffy feathers. You see that a lot in bird chicks, is that they're really fluffy looking, and I don't know why, but they are. And then their legs are large for their size as chicks. And then the bills of chicks are a much darker color with a white tip. Juveniles, so bird teenagers pretty much, have a similar color to the adults, but it is a duller tone, so it's kind of not as flashy. And they also have this dark bill with that white tip on it that slowly transitions into a more reddish color as they get older. As for behavioralness,
No, sir.
as for their behavior, what the heck? They're very loud. They make a lot of noise. They have 3 different distinct calls, I guess. There's a loud shriek, there is a quiet hoot, and there is a muted boom. Those were the descriptions I found. So, see how accurate they are. And that muted boom sound, which I can only imagine sounds like that is a indication of alarm, of trouble, of watch out, gang. They're also intensely territorial species, especially when they are breeding. So we'll get into breeding in a little bit. They mainly like to live in grassland areas, so kind of prairie in a way. And then once it begins to snow, once it transitions into winter, it begins snowing, those grasslands get kind of covered up, and it's harder to find food. They'll move into kind of more forested scrubland type areas where the ground is a little more open and they can find food easier. And as for food, they like to eat grass, shoots, insects, and the most common food that they eat, their favorite foods, are the leaves of Chionocla tussocks. And they like a lot of alpine grasses. So those grasses that you're going to find in the higher elevation grasslands. One specific record has shown that a takahe was seen eating a paradise duckling, which is this. Look at that cute thing. How could you eat that? And this was not seen before. People were kind of surprised, but then they looked more into it. Their closest relative, which we talked about previously, the pukeko, has often been found feeding on eggs of other bird species, so it's kind of understandable that they would feed on similar things, on eggs or chicks, but it's still out of characteristic. I mean, my guess would be that food was sparse at this time, and it was trying to find whatever it could. And that poor duckling was in the wrong spot at the wrong time. And the takahe made it its prey. Yeah, I rhyme sometimes. It's just kind of a side gig, really. I just like to rhyme in my spare time. Now, on to breeding, on to making more takahe. The species is monogamous, so they get one mate, and that's it. They mate together for their entire lives. They breed typically once a year. Sometimes they'll breed more than once if the first breeding doesn't work. They build very bulky nests, typically under bushes or scrubs, so they like having something above the nest, probably so other bird species can't swoop down. A hawk or something would love a little takahe chick snack. And then, as I mentioned earlier, very territorial, and these territories for breeding pairs can be absolutely huge, depending on the availability of food, kind of how the conditions of the year are. The territories can range from 4 to 100 hectares, which, let me real quick. Okay, so 4 hectares is 0.015 square miles, and then 100 hectare is 0.3 square miles. So, I mean, not huge, but pretty big for a bird. And then they'll typically lay their eggs in late October all the way through January. So they have quite the broad range of when they lay eggs. And then they will share the incubation duties. So the male and female will both incubate the eggs. And incubation typically takes about 30 days. And they will lay 1 to 3 eggs. Most common is 2 eggs, right down the middle. That makes sense. And then chick survival rates are very dependent on the area, the availability of food, things like that. So it's a super broad range. I can't talk today. Oh my gosh. It's a super broad range. I'm not too sure why they even included it, but I figured it was interesting. So chick survival rates can range anywhere from 25 to 80%, which isn't great when you only have 2 eggs. As I mentioned, pretty long lifespan, so fairly long generation length of 4.6 years. For a bird, that's pretty long. And then this was just a fun fact that I found, and I figured I'd put it kind of in the middle of the video. But they have a very fibrous diet. Like I said, grasses, leaves, lots of fiber in their diet, so they poop a lot. And they can poop up to 9 meters a day. That's like 25 feet worth of poop from a little tiny bird. Now, I'm assuming 9 meters is not the typical day, because that's a lot of poop for a little bird. I mean, they must be munching. Okay, now we're going to go into the most interesting part of the takahe. So hopefully you made it this far into the video. I know it's already been, I've already been recording for 20 minutes, so, So, before they were even officially described, they were hunted extensively by both European settlers and natives of the area. And then they weren't described using live specimens. They were actually described and named using fossils, which is odd for a bird that still exists. But they were very rare. The first living bird was not found officially until 1850, so 3 years after it was named and described. And then 4 more were found by 1898, and then they were presumed extinct. So 1850, they were like, oh, we found one. This is crazy. They're still alive. And then by 1898, they were like, they're gone. It wasn't until 50 years later, on November 20th of 1948, that the bird was rediscovered by a man named Jeffrey Orbell in a remote valley in the Murchison Mountains. That's wild to me. This bird was completely hidden from humans for 50 years. That's impressive. That's very impressive. I mean, especially like a bird of that size. It's not like a hummingbird, But there are very remote parts of New Zealand in the mountains, so it's somewhat understandable. But this expedition, Jeffrey Orville actually went on an expedition to find a bird because they found unidentified bird footprints around the area. So they saw footprints and they were like, I have no idea what that is. So they went looking for it, which is awesome. I want to do that. I want to be a guy that they call up. They're like, yo, James, we found some weird footprints. Could you go in this remote valley and just kind of look around? That'd be awesome. And only 2 takahe were found on this expedition. Currently, the species is still managed by the New Zealand Department of Conservation, and there are populations in the Takahe Valley where they were found, which they renamed the Takahe Valley, and several offshore islands, which we'll get to that in a little bit. We'll get to that right now, actually. I forgot where that was in my sheet. So those islands, they have actually been reintroduced to. So part of the conservation efforts was relocating a few populations of birds. They relocated to a few different locations across the mainland and to a few different islands. We'll get a lot deeper into the weeds of the conservation efforts in a little bit. I'm just kind of giving you a little overview now. They're currently considered nationally vulnerable by New Zealand government, and they were actually downgraded from critically vulnerable to nationally vulnerable in 2016. And they are listed as endangered by the IUCN Red List. And so, like I said, 2 birds were found in 1948, and currently the estimation of the population is about 500, and it is roughly predicted that it is growing by 8% a year, which is very good. I mean, a growing population, that's good news, baby. So back to when it was first discovered and named. It was named by an anatomist named Richard Owen, and he was sent the fossils in 1847 by a man named Walter Mantell, who was a fossil collector. So he had these, and he was like, I don't know what these are. So he sent them to Richard Owen, who then coined the genus Notornis, and the new species was named Notornis mantelli. And at that point, they did not know if the bird was still alive or extinct. And then in 1850, a group of sealers encountered and captured a large bird that, in quotes, these quotes from the sealers, it ran with great speed, and upon being captured, uttered loud screams and fought and struggled violently. It was kept alive for 3 or 4 days on board the schooner and then killed, and the body was roasted and ate by the crew, each partaking of the dainty, which was declared to be delicious. That description lines up with what we know of the bird today. And then the bird's skin was saved and given to Walter Mantell, who then sent it to his father, who was a paleontologist. That was a hard word for me to say. Gideon Mantell. And Gideon Mantell declared that the bird was in fact Notornis mantelli. A few more birds were captured in the following years, including one in 1879 along the banks of the Lake Te Anau, which is a very large lake in New Zealand. And this bird was captured, I think, by a dog. So it was dead when they got it. And the bird was sold to the Museum of Zoology and put on display there. Sadly, that bird was destroyed in the bombing of Dresden in World War II, which I didn't know that New Zealand got bombed in World War II. That's kind of crazy. And then another specimen was found later that was also killed by a dog and found, and it was sold to the New Zealand government and put on display. And for many, many, many years, it was the only takahe on display in the entire world. The third specimen collected was examined by Adolf Bernhard Meyer, who decided that there were skeletal differences between the Fiordland bird and the North Island specimen, and that these differences were sufficient enough to make a new species, which was then named Notornis hotstedteri. Throughout the years, many hunters and settlers reported sightings of birds that were described to be very similar to the takahe, but none of these were confirmed. It was all, hearsay, and soon after it was ruled extinct. Now, getting into a little more of the current conservation efforts and the conservation efforts that have been applied through the years. So, small populations, as I said, have been successfully transplanted to 5 different offshore islands. And these were specifically chosen because they are predator-free, So they picked those islands because it was the best chance for the birds to survive, which they have. And then on these islands, they can also be seen by the public. You can go out and I don't know if they have takahe tours or what, but you can go see them. There are also multiple places with captive takahe, such as the Te Anau and Mount Bruce National Wildlife Centers. And they have done some captive breeding. 2 captive chicks were successfully bred in 2018, but sadly they both died due to heavy rain exposure. Whoops. And then these deaths kind of rekindled some controversy, which I'll get into in a little bit, about non-interference. So just a little teaser for later in the video. Stay with me now. Don't leave. I know it's been long. Don't leave. Okay, so let's take a little break from conservation efforts and let's get into why we need the conservation efforts. Okay, let's talk about what happened to the takahe. Why did their numbers drop so much? So numerous things led to this. Overhunting, which I already mentioned a little bit, loss of habitat, and then also introduced predators have not helped them out. So loss of habitat actually came due to post-glacial forest expansion. During kind of the Ice Age-ish area, New Zealand was very icy, very flat. Not as much forest, not as much tree growth. So there was a lot of habitat for these birds, with a lot of grasslands, shrublands, and areas that they thrive in. However, due to the natural climate change following that, more trees sprouted up, and kind of took over these grasslands and really diminished the amount of habitat available to these birds. So that was a very big contributor to population decrease. On top of all that, due to population going down, interbreeding rate went up. So a lot of inbreeding led to low fertility rates and just really put a strain on the population that was already struggling. And this has also caused some problems in the recovery efforts because getting birds that aren't related is difficult, and low fertility rates makes things difficult. That's kind of the main thing that happened. So their numbers were already struggling before European settlements were established and the Europeans started hurting, which is rare. Usually, it's all the Europeans' fault. Not in this case. It was actually a lot more due to Polynesian settlers, which were some of the first settlers to New Zealand, and they hunted a lot of the birds. They brought dogs and rats, which hurt the population. And so that was kind of a second wave of sharp decline in the populations. And then on top of that, these birds have been going through it. When European settlers arrived, they brought a lot more herbivorous species, such as deer. And deer like eating the same food and living in the same areas. So they for the most part, outcompeted the birds and led to even more struggles. So that's kind of what happened to them. Now, back to conservation. When the bird was first rediscovered, it brought a lot of attention, right? Species thought to be extinct is not. That's quite the headline, right? So it brought a lot of attention, and it led to some controversy. So the first thing New Zealand government did was close off the area that the birds were found in. So they were already found in a national park, so they cut off access to that whole area, and they were like, okay, part one, done. And then the public brought in some controversy, as per usual. There were two kind of thought processes on what to do with these birds. One was to just leave the birds alone, right? Let nature take its course. If they survive, they survive. If they don't, they don't. Which is a harsh thought, but in some cases, it's fair, especially in cases where the numbers are naturally decreasing. Now, at this point, when they rediscovered, there was a lot of human cause to their decrease. So that thought process is a little flawed, but I understand where they're coming from. Humans not interfering with nature is always the best course of action. But when humans have already interfered, trying to revert the causes that humans have caused is sometimes necessary. And then, of course, the second thought is to help the bird, right? Intervene with nature and try to bring the bird back. Due to this controversy and to lack of resources, nothing was done other than closing off that park for about a decade. About a decade passed, and they were like, "We'll just leave it alone. We'll figure it out next time." That happened, and then they started interfering. They started working to help the bird. So the first breeding center was established in 1985. They were an interesting breeding center. So they didn't have birds in the breeding center. They just would bring in eggs and incubate the eggs. And in order to try to lessen the human impact on these newborn chicks, they fed them with puppets, with hand puppets that were supposed to resemble their parents, and they would play sounds that their parents would make. So they would play the screeching and the low booming whatevers, which is interesting. And then once the chicks got older, they would put fiberglass replicas of adult takahes in the enclosures, which is a little dystopian, a little sad. So this approach was cut off in 2011, and they don't use that strategy anymore. So that was one conservation push. Another was, as mentioned, relocating adults to offshore islands. And many of these succeeded, and the takahe populations established themselves on these islands. However, due to the small size of islands, the birds fairly quickly reached their carrying capacity. So basically that means carrying capacity is decided by predators, food availability, and stuff like that. So how many birds can the island support, pretty much? So they reached that carrying capacity. And then that has also led to problems because you reach the carrying capacity. That's the amount of birds that can be supported by the island, right? And that number wasn't really big enough for the populations, and it started leading to inbreeding and lack of genetic diversity and causing problems on those island populations. So the islands have worked, but it's kind of yet to see how well. And then another conservation strategy that has been implemented is humans intervening with the wild populations of birds, trying to improve the reproduction success rate. So some of these include removing infertile eggs from nests, and introducing captively raised chicks so they can be raised by the parents instead of the infertile eggs. These kinds of efforts have been somewhat successful. A rate of 0.66 chicks per pair has been found in manipulated populations, while a rate of 0.43 chicks per pair is found in unmanaged populations. So it does seem to be helping, and recovery efforts have really been going since the 1980s. That's when the first recovery plan was really made and set into action. And controlling the invasives or introduced species has also been a big push, especially the deer. They've been really hammering down on deer lately, trying to decrease their numbers. And that seems to have helped improve the amount of habitat available to the takahe and the amount of food available. Another species that isn't really confirmed or denied to have a big effect is stoats. Stoats were also introduced by the Europeans, and they're thought to kill chicks and eat eggs, but that's still kind of being researched. They're trying to figure out if stoats have a big effect or not. So what has the outcome of all of these conservation pushes been? It's been successful. So the population in 2013 was 263, 2016 306, 2017 347, 2019 418, and then 2023, like I said, is about 500. So population has been on the up and up, which is very good. If I had to estimate, just using my knowledge, my basic knowledge of how the world works, I would say that they'll continue going up to a certain extent, and then because I feel like the carrying capacity on the island of New Zealand and the other islands is relatively small for these birds right now. So I think it'll continue increasing to a certain point, and then we'll kind of level off, and that's when we will really see whether or not the bird will sustain or come back down. A lot of it depends on what that carrying capacity is and whether or not it can support the birds without a lot of inbreeding. If the population is big enough, then it'll be great. They should be able to sustain for years to come. If it's not big enough, then we'll see it come up to its carrying capacity, level off for quite a few years probably, and then start back on the downtick, which honestly, that's what I would predict. Like, I'll predict it'll go up to wherever it stops, level off, and then start slowly coming back down due to infertility and problems related to inbreeding. Hopefully, that carrying capacity is big enough to where they can just level off, become a new stable part of the ecosystem. Only time will tell. But the conservation push has been successful overall. Anytime you see an increase in numbers, that's a success, right? That's how I see it. But time will tell. So that's all I got for you. That is the takahe. I hope this was an enjoyable experience for you. Smash like, click that subscribe button too if you haven't already for more animal videos. And yeah, like I said, hopefully this was informative. I think this is one of the most interesting cases of an endangered animal and a conservation effort that I've ever seen. Just the being extinct and then coming back alone is crazy. And then the different strategies that they have taken to increase these numbers is wild. Hopefully the push continues. Hopefully the bird stabilizes back out and it'll be around for years to come. So thank you all so much for watching. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. If someone in your life is struggling, reach out and let them know that you love them. Let them know that you care. You haven't heard from a friend in a while or a family member, call them, say what's up, just check in. It'll help. I guarantee you. It'll mean a lot. So that's my words of wisdom. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see all of y'all later.